So welcome back to a Safe Place podcast, and we're joined by Linda Easto. Is that the way you pronounce your second name, Linda?
Yeah, it is.
That's good news. And you're a family recovery coach, aren't you? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And you're the founder of Hopeless to Happy Coaching.
I am.
So talk to us about that then, Linda.
Okay, so Hopeless to Happy Coaching sort of came about at the beginning of the pandemic was when I first set it up. And there was a bit of a journey to get me there. So the family recovery coach side comes from my experience of dealing with a son who was in addiction for 25 years.
25 years?
Yes, I've only recently found out it started when he was 15.
Yeah.
So I always thought it sort of started late teens, early 20s. And it became obvious to me probably when he was about 19 that he hadn't got a healthy relationship with alcohol.
Yeah.
And all his friends were big drinkers. So, yeah, at the time, I knew something wasn't right, but you try and talk to him. And no, he hadn't got a problem. And of course, all kids do that at, that age.
Yeah.
So then I started doubting myself and thinking, right, am I just getting this all out of context? But I can remember one of his friends saying to me that they'd all go out on a night time, have an absolute, ball, drink loads. And they'd all get up the next morning and they'd all be going, oh no, never again. But my son got up the next morning and just started drinking again.
Yeah.
So I think, and I was only talking to my daughter about this last night, I think his friends obviously saw a lot more than I did. But probably went through an awful lot with him because he's just, he's not a nice drunk. And I think, there was probably an aggression inside of him. So when he drank, that aggression would come out because he's not like that normally. He's a pacifist, if anything.
Yeah.
But alcohol just didn't suit him. So I think he was in his early 20s that he did sort of agree that he thought there probably was a bit of a problem. But like most addicts, they're in denial.
Yeah.
They're in denial for so long until there's negative consequences and their lives start falling apart, I suppose. So he was probably about 23, and where I lived, there was a young family living next door, a single mom, and he ended up marrying her, and they went off to Australia for 6 months. And it was probably at that point, me and my daughter were just sort of like, there was nothing we could do. He was the other side of the world. If anything was to happen, we couldn't get to him. So I think we relaxed at that point, because prior to that, I think my daughter and me were just like high alert constantly, because he used to get himself into such dangerous situations when he was drunk. Or, we'd get phone calls all through the night. I mean, there's so many stories I could tell you.
It's fascinating as a recovery coach, and you're there now in people's lives that are dealing with or have dealt with somebody, a loved one, suffering with addiction. You're there after everything that you've been through, and what's fascinating is with the type of addiction, we're looking for a behaviour that's a mood-altering behaviour. We're looking to try and feel better, aren't we, ultimately? And what's difficult for people that's going through, in a sense, is as the loved ones are going through an addiction, which is a mood-altering behaviour to try and alleviate some sort of discomfort or negative emotions or thoughts, the people that are there experiencing a loved one going through it, in a sense, their child becomes their addiction. That they're trying to change and alter their state to improve their lives so the person themselves feels better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's right. Because, I mean, anyone that goes down the path of addiction is a symptom of something much deeper. And what happens is, without the families realising, it's such a slow process, and the addicts are so manipulative, and that's the addict, it's not the person.
Absolutely, yeah.
But you end up being addicted to them.
Yeah.
You are addicted to their like you say, their moods, their behaviours. If they're happy, you're happy. If they're in chaos, your anxiety kicks in because you just don't know what's going to happen in the chaos. So, yeah, it's called codependency.
Yeah.
I think years ago they used to call it co-addiction or something.
They change the names a lot, don't they?
They do, yeah, trying to keep up with
But
it
it's
all.
fascinating to think that you've got this young man, like many young men and many young women also, that has some sort of baseline experience of self that is somewhat slightly uncomfortable or doesn't feel right. They find a substance that alters that state, makes them feel better. If we asked your son, how was he? Who was he when he drank alcohol? He was probably more like the person that he wanted to be, more like the person that he wanted to feel. So he got something from it. And then as the loved one experiences somebody that they dearly love going through the addiction, we then try and alter them in a sense to try and feel better in ourselves. So it's absolutely the same type of addiction, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's very interesting working with families because a lot of families don't get it. They just don't get that they've become addicted to their addict.
Yeah.
And that's because they're in denial initially.
Absolutely, yeah. It's fascinating,
it's like
isn't it?
planting the seeds. And then I can remember I found a group for me in 2013. So I'd sort of been flying solo for 18 years until I found somewhere. And I'd been going there probably for a couple of years. And codependency had obviously been mentioned because a lot of the recovery process is repetitive because you only take on board what you're ready to hear at that time.
Yeah.
So a lot had gone whoosh over my head. And then one day he was talking about codependency and I sat there and I'm like, oh my God, he's talking to me. That is me. But as I say, I'd been going there for a few years. And I had, I'd really started to change and I understood more about addiction and how the addicts work and how it impacts us. So I'd sort of got my head around a lot of things, struggled with the enabling side, struggled with the boundary side, which I'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
But yet it was just that, oh my God, he's talking about me. All of a sudden I was like, yeah, my life depends on my son's happiness. So I hadn't got a life by that point.
In the same way that your son's life depended upon alcohol.
That's right.
That's how we can see the similarity in addiction there, can't we?
Yeah.
So you have that moment after a few years, finally that information just seems to go in.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden there's almost like an aha moment, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah.
So how do we move from there? What's the next stage that you experience, Linda?
I think from there, once I realised that I was dependent on his feelings and what he was doing, I was then able to start making changes for myself and start on my self-care journey, I suppose, or my rediscovery journey.
Yeah.
Because once you get your head around it, once you realise it and you're like, right, okay, that's what it is, it's at that point you can then start to move forward and do something about it. So I think I probably went through the rest of that year trying to put boundaries in place. Boundaries, I think, are difficult for loved ones of addicts because of the fear element. And the fear element is all around. They don't understand addiction and their addicted loved one gets themselves into some really, really vulnerable situations and dangerous situations. So, yeah, they just don't. The fear factor for a family member is like huge.
I can't even imagine it. But as you rightly say, that fear factor, and when that fear is triggered, it's so easy for us to fall back in the unconscious coping mechanisms to alleviate our suffering, which was to help him, and to support him. We fall back into it, don't we?
That's it. I did it so many times. And I now know that was me relapsing because I was getting on my own recovery journey, if you like. And I tried to put boundaries in place. And then because of the fear, the boundaries obviously weren't the right boundaries at the time for me to stick to, because that's something else I always say to people. For you to put a boundary in place, it has to be something that you are comfortable with and you can carry out.
Yeah.
If you're not comfortable with it and you know that you can't carry out, don't put it in place, because by going back on your boundaries, you don't feel good because you're like, oh my God, I said I was going to do this and now I can't do it.
Yeah.
But it gives mixed messages to the addict. So they then think, oh, wow, she backed down last time, so she'll back down again. So they will go on and on and on and on because they're like, oh, she'll back down eventually. Obviously, it doesn't always happen. But little boundaries, little things I will always say, start off with, and this is probably the first one that I started off with, switch your phone off of a night time when you go to bed. Because addicts, they get lonely and they get, nighttime is not good for them. And I used to get phone calls all through the night and I need my sleep. So for years and years and years, I must have been like a zombie.
So how difficult was that, Linda? Because as I hear you speak, I try and get into your experience in a sense. So I've said to my son or my daughter, or I haven't said it to them, I'm just not going to turn that phone on the night. The scary thing for me is once I choose to turn that phone off is if there was a message where he needed immediate help, as you said, he gets into really vulnerable situations and our mind always races to the worst case scenario. He could die. And if I wasn't there to answer the phone, I then blame myself for his death in a sense. How do we break that difficult mental battle?
I think, and this is probably one of the initial things. I mean, there's the 3 C's, isn't there? You didn't cause it, you can't control it, and you can't cure it.
Yeah.
So I always start off with those basics, but I've added my own C now, which is you do have choices. So you have to get your head around understanding the 3 C's, because I think the first thing is, as a parent, you will go right back to the day they were born, thinking, what did I do wrong?
Yeah.
And no one causes addiction. You can't cause someone else to drink alcohol or to take drugs.
No.
And then the second thing is you've got no control over anyone else's life except for your own. And that is a hard one, because I now know that I was a control freak. My daughter was a control freak.
Yeah.
So we just tried to control his life. He didn't have to make dentist appointments. He didn't have to make doctor's appointments. We'd give him lifts here, there and everywhere. Even take him to get his drugs when he and
it's perfectly understandable why we do it, because we dearly love them. We want them to be okay, so we're okay. And that brings us on to the idea of becoming the enabler for him at the time. You was doing everything for him, which only enabled his addiction more so, didn't it?
Yeah. And I think that's hard for people to get their head around. I've recently done, because I now run a face-to-face family group for a charity that's just opened in Lichfield called Better Way Recovery.
Yeah.
And they asked me at Christmas, would I go and do a family group? So I was really grateful for that. And a couple of weeks ago, I did the enabling model, and it is, are you loving someone to death? Because that's what you're doing, really. Understandably, you do it out of love.
Yeah.
You do it because you want to protect them. So on one side of the page, it was all the enabling behaviours, like paying for their phone, paying for their accommodation, paying their electric, like their utility bills. It's like I say, giving them money. It's like, Mum, can you lend me 20 quid? I think that is just a standard, Mum, can you lend me 20 quid? And when you start getting yourself into recovery and you start realising that giving money is a no-no, take them to get groceries, take them out for a meal, invite them round for a meal, just don't give them money. My biggest thing was, as a mum, I couldn't stand to think he was hungry.
Yeah.
And I hated to think he was cold. And he's never been interested in food, funnily enough. But I'd got this thing, I didn't like him to be hungry. Yeah. He'd rather have a cigarette than have anything to eat. Just typical. And I didn't like him to be cold. So if he said he needed money for electricity, I'd give it to him.
Which in one sense, you're saying you don't like the idea of him suffering.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that they're all the same thing. I don't want my son to suffer. And by carrying out the 3 C's, in a sense, it would seem that in the short term of you working through yourself, that's going to increase his level of suffering to a degree. So it's almost like a conscious decision that, as you rightly say, you can't control him. You didn't cause this. What was the fourth C that you said you've introduced?
I introduced choices. You do have choices.
Yes.
And I think that's what we forget. When we've got a loved one in addiction, we can choose to put our self-care first. And I'm a big believer in lead by example, because you are your addict's best chance of recovery. And by you starting to make little changes, it forces them to start changing their behaviour to a point that sometimes I think the addict will look and think, oh, well, and don't get me wrong, if they're in addict mode, it will be all selfish and me.
Yeah.
But if they're in their actual normal person mode, they would look and think, oh, well, mum's looking after herself, mum's doing this, mum's doing that.
So if we carry on enabling them, we can only hypothesise through that behaviour that they are going to be an addict for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
If we can adopt these 3 C's and the 4th C of the choice, as you rightly say, we increase the chances of being a model in a sense for them and how we can overcome our own addiction and almost lead the way in a sense, or inspire, or hopefully get through to them that they can too in a way. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think another big thing is to let them know that you love them, because they don't love themselves and they don't feel lovable. You know, they can't see why anyone would even like them. So
as you say that, Linda, what's significant there is the idea of that shame.
Yeah.
That shame feeds the addiction, doesn't it?
It does. The guilt, the shame, judgment, you know, but all of these things feed the families as well.
They do, yeah.
So, yeah, it's just, I always say, whenever you speak to them, always tell them that you love them. Always ask them if they're ready to get support for their addiction. And, yeah, just tell them that you will support them. If they make the right choices, you will support them. And it got to this point with my son that the addiction got really bad, and it will get worse when you start making changes. Initially, it is going to get worse. Yeah. But my son, his addiction was really bad, to the point that the professional services had written him off. Everyone had written him off. But I still knew deep down that he could make it, and I knew. Don't ask me how or why. I always knew he could make it, and I always knew he would. But going down that path of when the addiction gets worse, the boundaries I got in place were I wouldn't spend time with him if he was under the influence. And there were times that, because by this time I'd moved to Leicester. The reason I moved from Tamworth to Leicester was because I'd tried everything possible to try and support my son and help him on his journey, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And I just thought, the only thing I've not tried is moving away. And I know it was pretty drastic, but I moved away, and within probably, trying to think the time scales, because the time is just a blur, there's that much that happened. So it was probably, I'm thinking sort of 6 months to a year. And as the pandemic hit, he was in hospital when the hospitals went into lockdown, and he literally collapsed in Tamworth for the umpteenth time. And it was on a morning that I'd gone over to take him to an appointment, because he was due to go into rehab. Because these last 3 years of addiction, his journey was trying to get into rehab, and he was desperately trying to get in, but I'd stepped back by this point. It was his journey. Yeah. He had to do it.
Yeah.
And that morning I'd phoned, I'm driving over now, so it's a 45-minute drive. I got to his, and I was knocking on the door, no answer. And I'm like, right, okay. So I started walking back to my car, and then I heard this bang, 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 bang. And I'm like, oh my God, he's just fell down the stairs again. And he was on the floor. I managed to open the door, and he was on his hands and knees, and he was like swaying, and he's like, Mom, don't leave me. And I'm like, Darryl, you can't go to an appointment in the state you're in. I said, so no, like, you know, I'm not staying. Ring me when you're okay. So I literally drove off. I just said, shut the door, go back upstairs and ring me when you're sober. And I drove off. And the next thing I knew was he was in hospital. And I don't know whether the hospital rang me or whether he rang me. I can't remember now because he was in hospital that much. They didn't even ask his name anymore. They knew who it was. So luckily this time he was put on the detox ward, and the practice nurse of his doctors said, just get him to stay there. Just get him to stay there. So I'm like, I'll do my best, because I didn't go and see him. I was just like, you know, just stay where you are. And his key worker from, it was One Recovery at the time, he said to me, try and get him to stay there. I think we've got an opportunity. And that man got in touch with the rehab unit, which is Burton Addiction Centre, and they said, right, when he's discharged, bring him straight over and we'll take him in. Well, you know what hospitals are like, so it was late on a Monday night, so I couldn't take him over. And I just thought, you know what, I'm not taking him back to his. He's been physically cleansed for a week now, I'll take him back to mine. And then I took him into rehab. They wouldn't have him because he got temperature. So I took him back to mine again because I knew that he was clean, he was safe. And then the week after he went into rehab for the third time. But it was different this time. He was doing it for himself. He was so physically and mentally shattered.
So it seems that he had to hit absolute rock bottom, didn't he? And that helped, in a sense, you not being there, because he never had that support.
That's right.
In a sense, which he, you know, depended upon. And for you, I mean, for you to go, leave him in that state, knowing that if you tried to help him, support him, you was only going to enable it, and it was only going to continue in him. I mean, these choices, Linda, have to be up there with the most difficult choices a human being can ever have to go through. It's
horrible. I mean, I've driven away with him holding onto the car door, just going, please don't leave me, please don't leave me.
Yeah.
And it is heartbreaking, but I knew I had to do it because he was under the influence, and I said I wouldn't spend time with him under the influence. I would spend as much time as he liked when he was sober and he was clean. I just wouldn't. It had to be, and it took years for me to get to that point.
Yeah.
It was a long, slow journey for me, and it was obviously very long, slow journey for him.
So people listening to this now that are going through a similar experience, Linda, what would you say for them to do? What have they got to try and do? Have they got to reach out for support? Can they contact you?
Yes, they can contact me now. Support that, I mean, at the moment, well, it's probably increased since the figures were released. There's 3 to 5 million people suffering through someone else's addiction, because for every addict, 4 to 12 people are affected by the addiction. It's like a ripple effect.
Yeah.
So obviously it's the families, but then you've got work colleagues, you've got friends, and it's just like a ripple effect. Reach out for help. You can contact me through my website. Am I okay to say what my...
Absolutely, and we'll put a link at the bottom as well.
Okay, so it's www.hhcoaching.uk, or you can call me on 07506 258 153. And I know there's a lot of shame, and I know that people don't reach out for the help usually until they're desperate.
Yeah.
But if you can start your journey earlier than getting to that desperate state, there's more chance of the addiction not lasting as long. It's just, it's just swallow your pride. The figures tell you, 3 to 5 million people,
massive amount,
without support. And those people desperately, desperately need support.
And there is support out there in you, isn't there?
There is, yeah. I do either face-to-face. I do a face-to-face group once a week, but I also I've got an online program that I wrote during lockdown, because the one thing that I realised through the group I went to is that face-to-face is not for everyone. the amount of times that people would come to a face-to-face group and then you'd never see them again.
Yeah.
So an online program is really important for those people. So what I did writing this, initially it was a 12-week program.
And people can access this through your website that you've given?
If they contact me through my website, I can then, they will always get an 1.5 hour consultation with me, and it's free. And what we do on that consultation is we'll look at what their life is like now, and then we will try and park that, even just for 30 seconds, and just say, right, where do you want your life to be? What do you want your life to be like? And sometimes that's difficult when you're in the midst of all the chaos. Yeah. But then what I do is I look at how we can get them from where they are now to where they would really want to be. And there's no quick fix. And I think that's something that there's no quick fix for an addict. There's no quick fix for the family. It's a journey.
It's a journey. It's a difficult one, but ultimately it's a process.
Yeah.
And if you follow that process, you're increasing your chances of recovery every step of the way, aren't you?
Yeah, definitely.
So, Linda, I'll put a link to your website at the bottom of the page. It's been an absolute pleasure for you here today sharing your story, all right?
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for turning it into, one of the things we said on the podcast is making the suffering worth it. You're definitely making what you went through worth it, because you're helping others now go through theirs, all right? So thank you, all right?
Oh, thank you. Thanks for inviting me on.
No problem.